Jim Baker was an extraordinary individual, and George Herbert Walker Bush was probably the nicest person I'd ever met in my entire life. He was not only an outstanding president, but just such a gracious person, so kind, that I developed this close relationship with him and really spent many years traveling with him in parts of the world. And everywhere I went, it would be Kuwait or it would be Asia, it would be the Middle East, he was well respected. And I couldn't find anybody that didn't like him, and I could see why. Because he was gracious, charming, funny, great sense of humor, and cared about other people more than he cared about himself. I just regret that he couldn't have seen this service, because he would have enjoyed it, no doubt.
David, as you're talking, getting some pictures of the advance team arriving at Joint Base Andrews, we still await the Bush family's arrival. But to your point, David, I think it was the Journal that said he was a gentleman in a culture growing cruder by the year. Dan Quayle said he was as close to the ideal of the office as anyone in our lifetime, and that was a theme that got repeated again and again today. So I'll ask you sort of the question that'll no doubt be tossed around in the days to come, and that is, what's the half-life of that message in Washington? Does it survive?
Well, obviously, we all hope the half-life would be quite long. The half-life of things like this probably isn't as long as we would like. I hope it'll be long, but we don't know. I would always say, though, about him that I always wondered what it was like to meet someone like one of the founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson. What were these people like? They all had their flaws. They all had human weaknesses, and we never met them. But I always thought that George Herbert Walker Bush would have been a perfect founding father. And if we ever had another Constitutional Convention, he would be the kind of person we would send to it, because he had so many good qualities. He cared about other people. He knew a lot about the government. He wanted the government to be bipartisan. He was probably the least partisan, president I've ever met. And while he had to be clearly a Republican in many ways to get elected, as president, he governed with a Democratic Congress and did quite a good job. Imagining today how much legislation one can get if you're a president of one party and Congress is controlled by another party. Very difficult to think you get a lot done. But he got a lot done with a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate.
But is that, and that's to your point then, is that enough to inspire a new generation of young politicians? Or is the tide of hyper-partisanship just too much to swim against, at least right now?
Well, it's always the case that people think that what happened the last year or two or three will happen in the next 1 or 2 or 3 years. The world changes and we don't know what will happen. I do hope that things will change and will be more bipartisan. And very, very often when you go back and look at history, you see that when Congress and the White House are controlled by different parties, you do actually have more bipartisan action. So let's hope that something more bipartisan will happen in the coming years. I would say that one of my yes, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
One of my fondest memories with President Bush was preparing for his 80th birthday party. He was going to jump out of a plane, as you know, and he wanted to practice it. He invited me to go down to Fort Bragg to practice with him, and we practiced in the wind tunnel. And in the end, though, he had the courage to do it. I didn't do it. But in that time, it was clear he was looking forward to doing it, and he had such a joy for life that I very rarely have seen anybody who enjoyed life as much as George Herbert Walker Bush, with his family, his athletic competitions that he would have, his friendships around the world. It was just nothing like that, and I really have never met anybody quite with all the qualities that he brought to the presidency and brought to friendship.
You know, I got to say, I'm not sure I have the courage to go skydiving either. But if I was going with a sitting or a former president, David, I might feel a little bit more comfortable if something went wrong in his skydive. You know, people would take extra precautions if I'm with him, right? I mean, didn't that give you some comfort?
Well, he had more courage than I did. There's no doubt about that, and he did a great job that day. When he did do it on his 80th birthday, Gorbachev was there in Texas, and George Herbert Walker Bush wanted to go by himself, but he had to do a tandem because of the clouds and the Secret Service and so forth. But he was quite a individual, and I've never imagined that I could meet somebody who will ever imagine I can meet somebody who will be as impressive a person in so many different respects, and a friend who is writing letters all the time. In fact, as I said the other day at a Kennedy Center event, I asked him to do a little favor for me about a week before he died, and he did it. I mean, he was obviously not in great shape. It just asked him to write a letter about something, and he did. And so, you know, I always will be grateful for my friendship with George Herbert Walker Bush.